Hello, this is Michael Perlman again, and I want to talk now a bit about what we've covered before. The first thing we discussed was how in competition prices tend to gravitate toward marginal costs, and with new technology, marginal costs fall. Given this tendency toward falling marginal costs and high fixed costs because of the nature of modern competitive pricing, uh, economies tend to go into a deflationary spiral. Now, a company in a situation like this has several options. First, they can compete by price wars without reinvestments. That was like the British textile industry that Keynes studied. That is, each of these companies would try to squeeze out as much money as they could without reinvesting, running down their capital stock, cutting prices, and hoping that they could carry on for as long as possible. The second way of competing would be by labor arbitrage. That is, to try to cut back labor costs faster than other companies, thereby squeezing out extra profits and holding back the tendency toward negative profits. And there are two ways to do this. First of all, you could move your business offshore and take advantage of lower wages. And certainly business has been doing this quite dramatically. Secondly, they can cut wages, cut benefits. Both of these options tend to destabilize the economy by creating severe imbalances. That is, ordinary people who previously depended upon wages in order to survive now have to either cut back their standard of living or go into debt. To cut back their standard of living crimps demand and therefore has negative effects on profit and can lead to this deflationary spiral, which is the inherent tendency of a modern economy with higher fixed costs and lower marginal costs. There's a third alternative, and that was one that became quite common in the late 19th century, and that was to compete by investing in new technology faster than other companies. And the problem with new technology is twofold. First of all, this new technology tends to have higher economies of scale, which means that each investment is going to create more output, so that if all companies try to do this at the same time, the market gets swamped and prices will go down faster than others. Not only will prices go down quickly, but if businesses choose to compete in this way, they will be throwing away technology before it pays for itself. So they'll be cut both ways. They'll be cut by lower prices, and they'll be cut by carrying the debt from the previous investments which are no longer viable. A third alternative would be to call upon the government to help them avoid competition through monetary and fiscal policy. Now, usually monetary and fiscal policy is seen as a way of perhaps trying to create full employment. But full employment, as I mentioned before, is a situation in which competition is blunted, prices have less pressure to fall, and in that way you can avoid this tendency within capitalism. But this alternative creates problems of its own. When the economy is performing relatively well, businesses will not modernize, capital stocks will age, and the economy will eventually stagnate, not from the demand side, but from the supply side. Another problem is when the economy depends upon active fiscal policy to maintain demand, there is a tendency to go into military spending, what's called military Keynesianism. This became very clear during the period after World War II. Liberal politicians were afraid of being labeled as socialists, so the only kind of fiscal policy that seemed appropriate within that political environment was military spending. Military spending, however, creates a different kind of problem. It gets you into foreign adventures, which become very extreme. They require large expenses that put pressure on government budgets, and they create demands, future demands, that will divert resources away from very important needs. Another alternative to avoid competition is through cartels or intellectual property. Now, both of these options have negative consequences also. A cartel, like active monetary and fiscal policy, is able to blunt competition because the members of the cartel are able to cut back production, which eliminates this downward pressure on prices. Intellectual property, in some ways, is even more destructive. First of all, intellectual property tends to severely limit, the potential of developing science and technology. Now, this is a very contradictory idea because intellectual property rights are supposed to give an incentive to developing new science and technology. But it turns out that what happens is that with the intellectual property, while it may give an incentive to the initial developer, it creates a disincentive because it makes it very difficult for other people to follow through. Besides, when other people try to break through these intellectual property barriers, it creates great legal costs, which cause very, very serious problems, creating uncertainty for anybody that wants to go into an area of science and technology, creating big legal bills, and making everything more complex. And then finally, of course, companies move into finance. Finance is a non-productive zero-sum game, which can turn into a negative-sum game when the financial speculation turns sour. Now, finance, again, is laden with contradictions, as it's true. Many companies could not get off the floor without having access to credit. But the credit system itself becomes very, very counterproductive. It becomes counterproductive because the financial system is able to extract huge amounts from the economy. I mentioned before that about 40% of all of the profits in business prior to the collapse went into finance. Finance is unproductive also because so many valuable resources get siphoned into the financial system. So, for example, during the dot-com era and during the era of great financial boom prior to the collapse, a good number of physicists and mathematicians were able to go into the financial system rather than doing anything productive. The financial system also uses huge resources, and because the profits in finance are so great and the bonuses are so great, they destabilize the economy by creating a very distorted distribution of income. So in part, when you hear about these huge bonuses, multi-million, even billion-dollar bonuses that some of the financial people get, since finance doesn't produce anything, this income comes from ordinary people. So it's no accident that you see a rise in finance with a rise in inequality. Something else is happening. Finance itself becomes a disciplinary force on business. That is, business itself has to follow finance more than it follows markets. Let me give you an example. A business may cut back on research and development because that creates a cost today with an uncertain payoff. Now, doing so can be suicidal, but to not do so means that quarterly profits will be lower, and a lower quarterly profit might make financial players encouraged to come and take over your company to try to squeeze money out of it and probably lose your job. So business goes into negative behavior in order to protect itself from the discipline of finance, or in order to satisfy the discipline of finance is a better way to put it. So what does all this mean? If we look at how this developed prior to the 2007 collapse, we saw all these happening in one way or another. We saw competition by price wars. We saw labor arbitrage, that is cutting wages and offshoring. We saw some competition by investing in new technology. We saw an avoidance of competition by Greenspan and fiscal policy, blunting the effect of competition. We certainly saw the rise of intellectual property. And most of all, we saw a rush to get into finance. Now, all of these created negative effects that made the system much more vulnerable to a crisis. Next time, I think I want to talk about how or why economists were unable to see this happening. And in doing so, I'm going to be talking about my forthcoming book about why economics took this tact, what they were about. The name of the book is The Invisible Handcuffs. It'll be published by Monthly Review Press in January, so it will have a very low price and make it accessible. So next time I'll talk to you about this. I hope to hear from you soon, to get your suggestions, and to find out what I can do to make these talks more valuable and even more interesting. So thank you very much, and goodbye.